Welcome, everybody. I'm Sophie Smith, the Assistant Director of the York Public Library, and I'm so pleased to have you join us for our program this evening. I'm still letting people in through the waiting room, so if I'm distracted, that's why. So tonight's program is about Indigenous climate justice and is brought to you through partnership with the Maine Humanities Council. This talk fits into our climate series that the York Public Library and the York Climate Action Plan Steering Committee have worked to put together to explore the different facets of the climate conversation in the months leading up to the town's spring referendum, where all the York residents will have a chance to approve the town's climate action plan. We've heard about the local fisheries and the benefits of saltwater marshes. And in the next week, we'll explore recent statewide climate reporting by the team at Maine Public Broadcasting. You can find out more about all of these programs at yorkpubliclibrary.org/climate, where we have recordings of the previous events and listings of those to come. We are recording tonight's event, as you can see, and it will be available on our website in the next few days once I get my video editing all together. By default, I have everyone set muted, but when our speaker is ready for questions, please feel free to unmute and ask away. You're also welcome to use the chat feature and I will relay your questions along. Without further ado, let's get started. One second. We're joined tonight by Dr. Darren Ranco. He has a joint appointment in the Department of Anthropology, the Senator George J. Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions, and in Native American programs at the University of Maine, where he serves as the chair of Native American programs and coordinator of Native American research. His research focuses on the ways in which Indigenous communities in the United States resist environmental destruction by using Indigenous diplomacies and critiques of liberalism to protect cultural resources, and how state knowledge systems rooted in colonial contexts continue to expose Indigenous peoples to an inordinate amount of environmental risk. A member of the Penobscot Nation, he is particularly interested in how better research relationships can be made between universities, Native and non-Native researchers, and Indigenous communities. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Ranco.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and I'm really honored to be joining you all tonight. I'm joining you from Dedham, Maine, in Penobscot Nation territory, and a place we call Wabanaki, which is Turkey Hill, loosely translated. It's a place where we see turkeys running around a lot in these hills. Just a few miles east of the Bangor Brewer area. And I want to, share, some of this is conceptual pieces, some of it is ongoing research that I'll share with you tonight. But I also, just forewarning, I'm fighting a cold, so I'm a little less energetic than normal. Although I will say, Sophie, that is the way I have my mom introduce me to other people in my family, just so they can track who I am. All right, I'm gonna share my screen and begin the talk. I want to give an introduction to sort of the notion of climate justice and the broader context for the work we're engaging in here with the Wabanaki Nations in what is now Maine, and in some ways it's actually our work, it stretches across Wabanaki territory. I want to just define a little bit of how the background of this work was started in collaboration and really by the leadership of the Passamaquoddy tribe at Pleasant Point, Civic, in a Bureau of Indian Affairs grant they got in 2015. And then conceptually, I want to talk about Wabanaki diplomacy as both a place and a process. For us, this is a way of doing our work, but also where we do our work. So there's a little bit of method and location in how I employ Wabanaki diplomacy. And I want to ask the question about sort of, can climate adaptation work in particular reflect Indigenous community perspectives and cultural frameworks? share some initial findings, and maybe think about sort of from adaptation to action across our landscape collectively as both Wabanaki and non-Wabanaki people. So the basic notion of climate justice is that some groups of people will be more impacted by climate change than others. And a just society will build this disproportionate impact into our climate mitigation and adaptation policies. Also critically, for Indigenous peoples, the value of our culture and our sustenance lifeways is a part of this discussion. So if you look around at Indigenous peoples and with our tribal nations here, a lot of this work around climate justice is to support ourselves culturally through our traditional sustenance and supporting our relationships to each other and our homelands. For the very first time in 2018, Indigenous peoples had their own sort of separate chapter in the United States National Climate Assessment. Delgado was the lead author of that chapter with a lot of help from a whole host of people. And there are three key messages, and this is where the justice elements really lie for not only Wabanaki communities, but more broadly Indigenous peoples across the United States. And one thing that these key messages really connect is not only the sort of the relative quote unquote vulnerability that we have as Indigenous peoples because of our land-based cultures in terms of climatic change, but also the legacies of colonization and how that also sort of make us vulnerable in terms of climate impacts. So the first key message is that, of course, Indigenous livelihoods and economies are at risk. Our livelihoods that are tied to not only sustenance lifestyle, but a lot of the sort of economic interests of tribal peoples related to anything from the arts like basket making to cultural tourism. These are key economic sectors for Indigenous people. These are all at risk because of climatic change. The second key message is that more broadly, our health is at risk. And in this report, the health is beyond just our physical well-being. It's of course, it is part of our physical well-being, but also our psychological or mental well-being, as well as our values and how we rely on our values and culture for our community health. These are all at risk because of the sort of first piece of the message, our livelihoods and economies being at risk. And then lastly, there is a set of relocations and impacts related to disaster management, displacement, and other kinds of relocation, and as well as sort of our ability or lack of ability to adapt to the new physical environments that climate change will bring us. One of the things that many of us here in Maine maybe realize or don't realize is that if you just look at sort of the percentages of Indigenous peoples across the United States, northern and eastern Maine are places of known, somewhat concentrations of Indigenous people. You can also see in yellow sort of our some of our lands as well. And I think this also denotes a certain kind of activism. This map is also filled with reflected on in the report as also the center of a lot of Indigenous people's activism around climate change. And then this is a really, I think, an important and amazing diagram that builds upon the three key messages that I mentioned before. Here, Delgado and the other authors of the National Climate Assessment give us this wheel of vulnerability. And in each of these sort of infrastructure and service areas that we as Indigenous people, the challenges we face in them are all interrelated and are also all legacies of a relative vulnerability caused by colonization. So you can look at, the first one, household and community infrastructure, the ways in which our communities struggle with poor economic conditions, limit our ability to access adequate household and local infrastructure. For example, 12% of Indigenous households lack a safe water supply or wastewater disposal. This is obviously something we face here in Maine. The same community, the same tribal community that led this work, the Passamaquoddy tribe at Pleasant Point, Civic, faces some real challenges with their water supply. Also is very much the context similar here in Maine, that the regional infrastructure systems within which most Indigenous people are located are also the ones that are lack sort of a robust and redundant systems for transportation, communication, water, power, and that Indigenous communities exist in other contexts that would otherwise be considered rural poverty. That's certainly the case here in Maine. In addition to, say, my tribe, the Penobscot Nation, we have the two reservations in Washington County, the two Passamaquoddy reservations, and then in Aroostook County, the Aroostook Band of the Micmac Nation and the Holton Band of Maliseets. And then just sort of this current lack of adequate public services around disaster response, really maps onto the regional systems infrastructure, and the wheel itself kind of is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Of when you have weakness in one of these infrastructural systems, it makes you more vulnerable to climatic change moving forward into time. Okay, so that's the relative injustice parts that we face as Indigenous people. The other framework that we mobilize in our work has to do with resilience. So in adaptation, we see the resilience of Indigenous people as located within our social and cultural systems. So we mobilize a lot of Indigenous knowledge and experience to frame up our understanding and also our priorities as we move, and you'll see more of this later, as we move and respond to climatic change. And this hooks onto some classical definitions of resilience that recognize that in order to be resilient, it is not simply putting in the infrastructure concerns that are making us vulnerable, but it also requires a bottom-up frame driven by community knowledge, inputs. The information transfer process must be directed by communities and done in a way that makes sense to our cultures and sort of the relative civic culture that we have within our communities. And then following on Kofinas and Chapin's work in Alaska, key to this work is identification of community assets, and that forms the core of our resilience. So those are just the frameworks of justice and resilience that we like to talk about in terms of Indigenous peoples and climate change. Okay, so let's get to some of our work. And I think you saw on the title slide, a fair amount of this data was gathered by my then graduate student, Natalie Michelle, who finally received her PhD a few months ago and is just now starting a postdoc with me to further this work. And I'll talk more about that at the end of the talk. So tribal climate adaptation here in the Dawnland. Again, I mentioned this grant by the Passamaquoddy tribes, Civic, but it's really, the goal of this work, the grant from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, was to help all of our tribes to build a community-based, culturally relevant climate adaptation plans for us, really focusing on the impacts to our health, looking at things like increased pathogens, destruction of tribal infrastructure, loss of habitat and subsistence resources, et cetera, changed by these climatic changes. And it also builds out of work where in 2012, for the very first time, FEMA did emergency preparedness plans with the tribes here and included climate and weather as a part of those. And in their initial modeling around impacts around climate change and sea level rise, the Passamaquoddy tribe, which is just right there on the coast at Civic, a lot of their infrastructure is threatened. And keeping in mind that their water infrastructure is already in deep trouble, and there's of course legislation right now in the state legislature to fix that. For us as an Indigenous researcher, I not only employ Indigenous research methods, which is built out of relationship and service to Indigenous peoples, and mobilize our forms of knowledge, but we also use frames such as community-based participatory research and sustainability science, ways to employ different forms of knowledge to solve societal problems. And again, understands the key to our adaptation is based in the community, social, and cultural resilience. So I mentioned a little bit about Wabanaki diplomacy as both a place and process in my introduction. Before we go into that, and I would, of course, I'm in a couple of these pictures in terms of the kind of work we do. I'm not running, by the way, but that, hopefully everyone knows where our tribes are located, at least in the seats of our government, across Maine, Penobscot, the two Passamaquoddies, Home Band, and the Micmacs up north. But that's not even exactly what the grant was about, because it was also, the grant was about adaptation across all of our lands. And here on the left side of this map, you see where our lands are, where the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot tribes hold a number of lands, a lot in the Penobscot River watershed for especially for us, but also some lands in Western Maine that we are stewarding and managing sustainably. And so there was also, the grant was supposed to kind of establish support systems and adaptation plans for all of these lands. But even more importantly, and this became critical as we did our research, that as people came together, Wabanaki people came together to work with us, at the in the leadership of the Passamaquoddy tribe. We mobilize a sense of our territory that is outside, beyond the borders of Maine. This is when we come together to solve problems that impact us all, such as climate change. Our process to do that work is in our diplomacy, it's in our Confederacy traditions, and that involves this entire territory. So when we mobilize, we don't just mobilize in what is now the state of Maine, we mobilize our knowledge and our experiences across this whole landscape. And that involves, obviously our four tribal nations, 5 reservations here in Maine, but as well as the 29 Micmac, 1 Passamaquoddy, 6 Maliseet, 2 Abenaki bands in Canada as well. So let me say a little bit then more about our Confederacy, because this is, our Confederacy reflects a series of protocols to collective problem solving that pre-exist, of course, the United States, that pre-exist the state of Maine, and are really tied to this landscape. So it's a process, a form of international relations defined by our Confederacy. It's multicultural, multinational in its origins, predates massive European arrival. It's reflected in our wampum belt traditions, and the protocols are embedded in the reading of our wampum belts. It's pretty clear that it becomes a bit more formalized during the initial waves of European colonization, but the frameworks themselves predate mass European arrival. The Confederacy itself, and this is just quotes from a couple of scholars who've spent years studying it, is a flexible form of diplomacy. It takes on many forms. It adapts to external pressures, and yet, and this was written 40 years ago, has existed for at least 3 centuries in the minds of Wabanaki peoples. That's Willard Walker's reflection on its formalization during early parts of colonization, but is also, as Matthew Dennis points out, a form of persuasive discourse. Our diplomacies enact forms of knowledge and clear-mindedness that are critical to a kind of collective decision-making. It also reflects a form of democracy that is structured through protocol that really is in some ways can be considered a sort of radical form of democracy. Consensus is generally the form of decision making that is mobilized, and part of this democracy is captured in this phrase from our wampum belt traditions in Passamaquoddy, Zidagwen Dole Wesdu. Everyone talks, or everyone has a chance to speak. And this forms a critical part of our interrelationships with one another, as well as our roles and responsibilities to not just humans, but to non-humans. And in many ways, the frameworks for this kind of treaty or this kind of wampum belt tradition, the very first kinds of treaties and relationships we had were with non-humans. So why is that important? And I kind of want to reflect on Kyle White, who's a really amazing Potawatomi scholar, philosopher, and is just so prolific and so important to this work. He has one article, he has a bunch of articles, but one is called Too Late for Indigenous Climate Justice, Ecological and Relational Tipping Points. One of the things that he points to, and this is very much true for our enacting our Confederacy and our diplomacy traditions through this work, is that climate change in Indigenous contexts is often mobilized around particular engagements of kinship. So he points out that contemporary Indigenous intellectual traditions, as well as political activism, reflects our relationships of mutual responsibility infused with appropriate qualities like consent and reciprocity. And these are often thought of as kin relations. These are obviously qualities that are crucial for cross-societal coordination. They take time to develop. So our work goes at a pace that is only through these forms of diplomacy and kin relations. But what emerges from these frameworks and stories is an understanding of how the fabric of relational qualities in a society can guarantee the coordination needed to adapt as best as possible to constant change. And one of the things that I think people misunderstand about our knowledge traditions as Indigenous people is just how good they are at adaptation over time. That in essence, and this is from a lot of scholars from a lot of different places, recognize that Indigenous knowledge traditions are actually some of the best when it comes to thinking about the changing interrelationships brought about by environmental or climate change. That while Western science traditions are good at using instruments and finding, single sectors, single species and tracking them, Indigenous knowledge systems tend to really focus on the interrelationship between ecosystem components and how they change over time. And that's just through our observations over countless generations, and seeing how they do change under different circumstances. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the collective sort of climate threats that were identified across the communities, across our Wabanaki Tribal Nations. And this isn't, and no means unique. These are all going to impact us all here in Maine and are in some ways already impacting us. There's of course temperature and increase in degree days, as well as the increase in winter ticks because of a lack of freezing temperatures during the winter. And you see that to the bottom there, the potential loss of moose and other culturally important species. This is already happening. Moose are being taken down by all these winter ticks, and the ones that are hunted often have thousands of these ticks and are almost completely drawn of blood by the time some of our hunters get to them. There's also the obviously increase in invasive species. We have a series of projects related to the emerald ash borer and its impact on our ash trees, which we make baskets out of and are formulated around some of our other cultural traditions. And then increase from erosion from increased precipitation and other feedback loops that, more erosion creates it harder for more fish. And then, with less fish, there are all these sort of other feedbacks. There's also increases, and many of you are aware that the Gulf of Maine, of course, is warming faster than 99% of the bodies of water around the planet. This is obviously having inland impacts, and these are in turn impacting fish and forest practices. Mentioned invasive species, ticks, mosquitoes, these are changing forestry practices. The northern Maine climate transition zone is already changing in terms of the kinds of plants, insects, birds, trees, and the rate of change for species, and this is something that Indigenous people, both here and across the planet, are seeing that species respond at different rates to climatic change, right? So some species will, it'll take 3 years for them to be displaced and move to another location. Others, it may take 30 years, right? They'll be able to hold on in certain ways. So the idea that, climate change is just like suddenly we're in the climate of what is now Virginia is really not what happens. What happens is totally new and different and often chaotic ecosystem arrangements are made because the species are actually adapting at different rates, especially when there's a sort of relatively quick change in temperatures, which we're starting to experience and will experience, of course, very dramatically in the next 50 to 8 years. And then the impacts on our cultural values and our health and well-being through subsistence cultures, our economics, our health, our recreation. So again, and we did this for each of the tribal nations, but our adaptation priorities involve across all of our tribes, and keeping in mind that where does our resilience come from? It's from our language, it's from our stories. Understanding our language and our stories will be part of this resilience and a core part of it. That's really a high priority for our adaptation. Then secondary to that, and this interconnects a lot of the physical work and the threats to us in terms of our health and well-being, is really fighting for our food sovereignty and our connections to food. These have been really diminished because of lack of access to certain territories. That's been a huge impact of colonization on us. But if you think about, of course, the moose are being impacted, but we haven't been able to access sea mammals for generations because the state and the United States have made it illegal for us to do so. So as we think about these connections, we're already entering into a space of diminished access, and that really already impacts us. So any then further impacts, right, are felt much more dramatically. And then, of course, we're working to protect healthy food webs, all those things. The other big three, the third of the big three, language and story, food sovereignty, is the work to protect cultural sites threatened by sea level rise and erosion. You see this in the work of my colleague, another Penobscot anthropologist, Bonnie Newsom, in her work to with with a host of others, including a number of Indigenous graduate students, to protect our cultural sites, to document them, to mobilize the stories embedded in them as forms of knowledge that can inform how we understand our response to environmental and climate change is just amazing. And then this is kind of a frame around protecting other cultural resources, projects that are involved in around protecting brown ash or cedar, spruce, sweetgrass, maples, et cetera, et cetera. I was also recently involved in a grant applying for a USDA grant to develop a demonstration farm that would show our traditional sustenance lifeways at Penobscot Nation. And one of the things that is invested in taking care of our soil. So soil for healthy foods is a critical part of teachings and sort of how we think of plants in Wabanaki traditions. So the priorities in terms of the actions relate to things like writing Wabanaki Confederacy climate adaptation plans, which will also engage the political and the cultural spaces of action after each community has their own. So this broader Confederacy work, mobilizing that, is to really decenter the kind of smallness that often goes with state or even nation state plans for climate adaptation. If we think of this more as ecosystems, an interrelationship between ecosystems and our responsibility to them, that's a reframe that is different than sort of the international arrangements to fight climate change, which are based mostly on counting CO2 emissions and concentrations in the atmosphere. So for us, and sort of the work we're doing is to really focus on what is common among us, the language and story traditions, but also the protecting of these sites along the coast, as well as the food security and food sovereignty. To do this work, we need to share knowledge and have strong communication and have a real shared commitment. And this has been a challenge during COVID, to using technology to our own ends, and to really work to leverage this Confederacy framework to help one another in a wider region. And this, the idea that in terms of food sovereignty movements, that our communities might all have different sort of specialties around which foods they're really focused on cultivating and how we might share them. And then, further priorities, part of the language and cultural work is the recentering of our clan mothers and our families to strengthen our identities. Our clan identities are often rooted in matrilineal relations and clan mothers. And this is very much tied to work that is referred to as rematriation, which is really about building and re-engaging the right relationships that we have between not only us as humans, but with our non-human relations. So these are often formulated around kinship or food communities, but they're really rooted in our clan mother traditions and some of this work. We really are committed to taking drastic steps if that needs to be, especially politically and culturally necessary to protect our land. Declare our rights and act, don't ask for permission, and really mobilize because of the international elements of our Confederacy, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that can link us and articulate our actions across the international boundary. The adaptation needs, and there are many, and this is just, again, a very small part of this, really look for education opportunities on climate related topics for tribal leadership and tribal citizens. This is really starting to take off with, again, mostly related to food and food sovereignty. This became a more acute issue during COVID. And you see this, though, really happening in ways that hands-on projects are being developed, community resilience around our food, not only in traditional methods, but also in, again, sort of reimagining our traditions for plants and caretaking of the soil through things like demonstration farms. more children involved in our community climate projects. At the University of Maine, with our tribal partners, we developed a youth science education program called WAYS, Wabanaki Youth in Science. And more climate is becoming a critical part of that STEM education program, which emphasizes Indigenous knowledge and experience. And one thing that we're just starting to do, and I think there's a real upside to this work, tribal governments, like other governments, are quite siloed when it comes to imagining and engaging in climate priorities and planning. So really drilling down on how to integrate our community planning as it relates to climate needs across things like transportation, social services, health, emergency response, wildlife, having those all together as opposed to siloed into different kinds of departments within our tribes is really something that'll be critical to this work going forward. So, in thinking of some conclusions here, maybe have close to 20 minutes for Q&A. This BIA grant work is ended officially a couple of years ago, but its dissemination and planning is ongoing. We've been able to get more resources to support this work. I mentioned the postdoc for Natalie. We're also engaged more formally now with the Northeast Climate Science Center at UMass Amherst and taking a real leadership role in terms of Indigenous collaborations around climate science across our region. Really, again, mobilizing Wabanaki diplomacy as both the place of our action, which stretches across these borders and boundaries, as well as a process of collective problem solving and engagement in building right relationships and responsibilities to not only each other as humans, but also to our non-human relations. And then just linking this planning work, as I said, in terms of tribal governments. One of our current projects is a climate adaptation menu, which is rooted in our traditions of environmental management, and it can be a real entry point for tribes across the greater Wabanaki area to engage in this work. One of the things that we're really conscious of is that being vulnerable in climate change discussions can mean a lot of things, and it often in the past 30 years has meant that those who are most vulnerable, the ones actually just holding on, are the ones that are forced to change, that they'll just be like, okay, give up on your forest, or give up on your lands, or give up on living close to the coast and your cultures. And really that is, of course, as it relates to justice, the quite opposite of what should be happening. That we really need to focus on how to build resilience in the potentially vulnerable spaces, and that will be to all of our benefit. That Indigenous peoples control a small percentage of lands, 11%, 12% of lands across the planet. That's where 80% of the world's biodiversity exists. So just giving up on Indigenous people and people who are vulnerable to climatic change is giving up on planet Earth itself. So for us, really thinking about who must adapt and who must change is a critical part of the political work and the cultural work that really challenges us. So I'll stop sharing, do a little bit of question and answer, and hopefully, I've given talks that are similar to this in other venues, so hopefully it wasn't too redundant for people who've seen some of it. I always try to add something new.
So everyone should be able to unmute themselves if you would like to ask a question. That setting isn't enabled, just wave at me and I'll figure it out. Otherwise, feel free to put questions in the chat and I can pass them along to Dr. Ranco.
Barbara.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Barbara. I have worked with one of your students, Dr. Ranco, and have learned so much from Sarah. My question is, are we taking steps to involve more Native Americans in teaching and research? And if so, how are we going to let them speak with their voice? And does that not begin with education and supporting them through the educational process into the research areas and sharing what they've learned way before we were here?
Such a great question. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of my job is to do that work. At the University of Maine, I will say that we've made a lot of great advance in that work in the last decade. I think, there's been a longstanding support for Native American students through scholarships, right, in the University of Maine system. But there hadn't been until the last decade work around what you're saying, which is how do we engage Native people and students into these research paradigms where we as Indigenous people can set these agendas. Some of that is challenging because it means it's not going to be just the same university, but with just brown faces, right? It needs to change, right? How we think of knowledge and how we mobilize it. Not crazily, but it needs to think about what kinds of knowledge we mobilize and for what ends in a slightly different way. So that means, so as we started the WAYS program, and we started with middle and high school students, and now we're doing it even in pre-K up at Holden Band of Maliseets. We're looking at ways to mobilize Indigenous science training for Indigenous students that involves both, our Indigenous knowledge systems and Western knowledge systems together. This approach that the Elder Albert Marshall, who's Micmac, developed in Nova Scotia, and that reflects as Wabanaki people our values and our ways of understanding knowledge. So to me, it's a pathway. We don't use pipelines. Pipelines are obviously evil, as we all know. That we develop these pathways for learning and education and framework that shift towards Indigenous knowledge, center Indigenous voice, and create really amazing students who that's not that they only learn as young people Western science and Indigenous science traditions, in seeing those, how they fit together or not. In fact, they're learning those two things, and then a third way of knowing, which is seeing the interconnection between those different knowledge systems, and they can be radically different. If you talk to anyone at the NSF or anyone who cares about 21st century learning work environments, that kind of skill, which is sometimes called convergence, is actually the key skill in the 21st century to have. So we're not only mobilizing this knowledge for Indigenous youth, seeing more success in science because they start to suddenly see themselves in their community and culture in their curriculum. We're mobilizing real leaders for the 21st century in both Indigenous and non-Indigenous contexts. So I think I agree with you. I mean, working in the context of Indigenous people, we are always working in, these seventh generation frameworks, right? I mean, we mobilize youth. It's so funny. I'm on all these research projects, and some of them don't involve many Indigenous people, and I can always tell when they don't have enough Indigenous people, when we haven't yet discussed, who's the next generation to do this. It's always, that's a critical component of our frameworks for thinking through our roles and responsibilities, is also to the seventh generation. So I think it's exciting work. It's critical work. It keeps me up all night. I have a cold now, but it's also what I think is going to save our place on this planet as humans. I think really this is the pathway forward. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Rebecca. Or Barbara, did you want to ask something?
Yeah, if Rebecca's gonna, I don't want to take Rebecca's place, but right. She seems to be having a little bit of
Hi.
internet.
Oh,
Go
there
ahead,
you go.
Rebecca.
Go ahead, Rebecca. Yeah.
Hi. You talked about working in some kind of non-silo structure. Could you talk a little bit about that, and have you tried using a circle kind of structure for communication and community input?
Yeah. So yeah, a couple things. So what I was referencing is actually it's sort of the formation of our tribal governments, right, which set the policy and agendas for our land management as Native people. What I think a number of people inside that system are frustrated because it doesn't reflect our cultural values, and nor does it reflect our diplomacies, which I was talking about. It's just how the funding lines in these governmental structures kind of force us into these silos in terms of programs and whatnot. I think actually in the protocols for our Confederacy, circles figure very importantly into arrangements of speaking, arrangements of protocol of who speaks when, according to various longhouse traditions, as well as other kind of consensus making. So yeah, I mean, circles figure, Indigenous people, we're all about circles, but I think, it's more that the structures which are colonial that we also still must work within, including in our own governments, that are some of these challenges. And I think if you talk to, policymakers, even in non-Indigenous contexts, right, they'll complain about the silos of policymaking too. It's like, it's one thing to have, of course, recent Supreme Court case is not great for this, but, it's one thing to have EPA, doing climate work, but if the Department of Energy isn't doing it, it's not going to help really that much, right? So this sort of siloed approach can exist in our own tribal governmental forms. And I think at least there is this discussion, I think, at this level. And of course, our governments tend to be a little bit smaller than, say, state or federal governments, where we can actually come together and frame it differently.
The reason I ask is because a number of towns in this area have been working on comprehensive plans, and some of them go on for years and they get rejected, and then some go. And so Agunquit is just starting one, and it really occurred to me the whole structure of it is silo oriented. And that's part of the reason why it doesn't work for me. I mean, people talk about overlap between one group subcommittee and another, but there's something about the communication structure that doesn't seem to work. And it makes it harder to pull the community into it when it's all this subcommittee silo kind of structure.
I totally agree. And I would say, I think, how do you work within, those spaces, that civic culture, how do you bend it to make it work better? Often requires some really, different kinds of brave leadership things. I also a little bit of a grassroots, people demanding it. Yeah. So I think, like anything, right, that the bold leadership and some grassroots sort of elements to kind of changing that. I don't know that much about town governments, that even though the state thinks that we're, as tribes, we're more like municipalities, but that in fact, our governments are quite are dependent on sort of governmental forms that are really driven by our relationships with the federal government, as well as by our own traditions of governance, which at Penobscot, for example, we don't have a constitution. Maybe we should, but our traditional laws that are voted on collectively by all people in our nation, right, is what the laws are. So it's actually it's a far more, on paper anyway, it's a far more democratic, it's not a representational government, it's a more direct democracy because the laws themselves tend to be voted on by our entire population. So yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know if it works great. It can, and it can work in really messed up ways too. Barbara, always good to hear from you, Barbara.
Thank you. And thank you for the talk. It was very helpful to me to it was such a whole piece. And I'm making circles with my hands. So I often hear from non-native climate activists with a lot of interest in what's happening in Indigenous communities and really looking to Indigenous communities for leadership for non-native people. And I'm wondering about actions of folks and in what ways do people, non-native people, do we do things that are helpful? And in what ways are they creating new obstacles and distractions from the work that needs to be happening in Indigenous communities for themselves?
Yeah, Barbara, it's such a good question. One of the things that I have two answers to that. Of course, the first and most obvious one is that in our state legislature right now, there is pieces of legislation which would really enhance our ability to control our own destinies as Indigenous people. LD 1626, LD, which is about our sovereignty, LD 906, which is about solving the Passamaquoddy water issue. There's some other ones, but those are the big ones that I strongly urge you all to visit WabanakiAlliance.com and figure out how to support those pieces of legislation. The other framework, so those are that's a very, advertising political kind of framework. I think what's more interesting perhaps is the kinds of frameworks around activism that there are spaces for it. And I know that you care about those spaces, Barbara, where, intersectional approaches to causes that, bring in things like, on the one hand, things like land return, rematriation work, food sovereignty, human health, right? Let's just put all of those things together. There are really, if we think about those as together intersectional movements, right? There is a space for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to work towards, on the one hand, land return and rematriation for Indigenous people's leadership and control, but also broader investments in local and Indigenous food systems that relate to the cultivation on those lands being returned. So I think that in essence, you can see that in things like the Mobilizing Land Trust or Land Peace Foundation has also, I'm on the board of the Land Peace Foundation, run by Sherry Mitchell. There's a kinship community and a food sovereignty community that she's been working on. Those are done in partnership and in radical forms of collaboration that, again, involve us to think in a more intersectional way. Like, it's not, what can happen sometimes is that, the price of admission that sometimes we as Indigenous people will ask things like land return or recognition of our full sovereignty, that those prices are almost feel like they're too high for non-Indigenous people to engage in. But looking beyond the point of why we want our land return or why we want our sovereignty, that those are focused on things that will heal us all, heal our earth, heal our health. There's some real opportunities there. So I think really digging into that, then there are some really amazing, as you know, Barbara, amazing Wabanaki women who are often the leaders of this work, right? Not, air sign Libra Darren Ranco. I'm very much a scholar, but they're very patient with me and teaching me how to mobilize these formulations of knowledge. So I think there's more opportunity, and I see that, and I know you see that over the last decade or more, ways of people coming together and supporting Indigenous people as Indigenous people for our own, systems, and not merely seeing us as, hey, we screwed up the planet, let's all take some Indigenous knowledge to solve it, right? That's not an appropriate framework, although I hear that sometimes in people who want to work with us. But what is it that we as Indigenous people, as Wabanaki people, would want out of relationships? And that shouldn't be that hard for people to ask themselves that question. But yeah, I think there's some real great possibilities. And I would say keeping track of the work that is happening with the land trust community right now is really inspiring. And I think, and I'm involved in it, and some really great people are involved in it.
Thank you.
Gary or Jerry, I don't know how you say your name.
Oh, Rente. Let me get this hand out of the way. One of the things that I was struck by, and it sort of goes to what Rebecca had mentioned in terms of silos and process. In addition to the kind of things that you just summarized, where there might be opportunities between the two communities to deal with specific issues. I mean, I personally had some difficulty. I'd have to go back and review your presentation, because it's difficult for me coming from a perspective of process, where all that sort of silos and committees and whatnot are just embedded in the way you think. Sure. As opposed to this very different perspective and lens that you're using that's traditional. And I wonder where, and maybe this is already being done, where there's opportunities to learn about the process, not just the issues that the communities face, but how they go about looking at them and coming up with solutions.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important question. I mean, process and protocol is so critical to the Confederacy and the diplomacies that I talked about. And some of that gets enmeshed in, the fact that as tribes, we are relatively small, isolated communities, that we have a healthy distrust of people coming from the outside, and how to engage in that, right? So I think even the frameworks of trust building and engagement are critically important here, right? So I think we ourselves are in the process of mobilizing these traditional processes. Like, sort of the point of this work is to mobilize it in the context of, 21st century carbon concentration, climate change. That is also our challenge. But in terms of how and when and where we mobilize our knowledge traditions into into that current dynamic is very much a recognition for the kinds of silos that you reference. Because I made it clear, like, the University of Maine is our Western academic context is by definition quite siloed. We have departments and we have all sorts of things that so the transformation is about openings and opportunities to support another way of doing things within a structure where it won't fall apart per se. So I think I think the engagement and understanding our process, starts with trust building, right? So, what could we work on together would be my question to you in terms of process work. It's very much because we're in the process of our own mobilization around it. I think we draw on ways of engaging and forms of mutual responsibility that are longstanding as Indigenous people and tied to this landscape. So how we all support that work is part of the process. So yeah, it doesn't get rid of any of the kinds of siloed process work, the subcommittees that Rebecca talked about. It is merely sort of how do we move through, if we know that, that's a problem for us coming to solutions, there are ways through that. I think the first thing, of course, is always identifying that problem. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but.
Oh, yeah, my question was maybe a little bit too abstract, and I think what I'm hearing you say is maybe you don't deal at the process level. You essentially learn by doing, and through engagement and watching how, quote unquote, the other side is approaching this, that those kind of learnings can get transferred.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, for sure.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. I'm gonna think about your question though, on my pillow tonight.
Well, maybe do we have time for one more question? It's a little bit after 8 right now, and I want to make sure we're giving you your time, your night back. Is there anyone out there who? Oh, there's Ed. A question for Ed.
Yes, I'm not Ed Bullock. I'm his friend Torbert McDonald. I have two things, Mr. Ranco. One is the state of Maine has a climate action plan that is very much oriented toward technology and corporate control of CO2. And the Indigenous perspective of changing ecosystems and the interrelationship within ecosystems and between ecosystems and seeing people as part of the ecosystem is very much needed in this climate action plan that's being developed, and it's totally missing right now.
I agree.
But biodiversity, the stat that you mentioned, 11% of the land in the planet is Indigenous land, but 80% of biodiversity is in that. And I'm sure that's true in the state of Maine as well.
Yeah.
So that's one point. The other, I have two books I'd like to recommend. One is Sproutland by William Bryant Logan, which deals with the long tradition of Indigenous people with both coppicing and pollarding trees so that they are less susceptible to insect invasion. In particular, I think the brown ash might well be susceptible to being pollarded because the ash borer gets into the trunk.
Yeah.
And in this case, the trunk is only about 7 or 8 feet tall. And then you have the growth from that, which could be used perhaps in baskets. The other book is called Eat Like a Fish, which is about by a commercial fisherman who used to be quite rapacious, like all fishermen are, and switched to growing seaweed, which is a potential growth item and one that can impact food sovereignty in many different ways, particularly for coastal tribes.
Yeah. Those are great recommendations. We have some nascent seaweed programs that we are developing. Our Aquaculture Research Institute is launching a series of new programs related to this work. So I think that's really on topic. I suspect it will happen soon. in terms of Indigenous management of seaweed cultivation. We have discussed those kinds of issues that are in the Sproutland book with the brown ash. We haven't quite figured it out yet. I'm not as involved in that project as I once was. But I would say, just to your point about the climate action plan for the state, yeah, that is entirely fair and critique of the state's climate action plan. I made it repeatedly, and then they put me on a subcommittee for the state to do this equity subcommittee. Anyway, it's like anything, though. I mean, are we making it better? Probably, in terms of the frames that you echoed that I had kind of set up. But whoever writes that first draft and whoever set that agenda, it's really hard to work this in there. So I'm not super optimistic. I think I've told people on the committee who are very diligent and serious, and that subcommittee is co-chaired by my tribal ambassador, Molly and Dana, and other people that recognize that the climate action plan did not, that was far more status quo than I think we were looking for, and really had very, very little. Actually, I don't think any Indigenous kind of frameworks that motivated it. So we'll see where it finally ends up. There's in the action plans developed out of this equity subcommittee, some things will be better, but it's hard once they set the agenda to really change it. So there you go. Don't complain too much. They'll try to put you to work. I should have learned that by now. I'm 50 years old. So I care too much, in these contexts. So I thank you so much for your questions.
Well, and thank you so much for your time tonight, Darren. We've really appreciated learning from you and hearing what you had to share. Jan put a link to a survey about this program in the chat, and I will also be sending it out by email tomorrow to all of you participants. But in the meantime, you can join me in thanking Dr. Ranco, and I'll let you all have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Goodbye.
You.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good night, feel better.